my favorite home decor crafts to make for Christmas are projects that are neutral enough to stay up all winter long. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Jess. Make sure you say hi in the comments. Today I have 3 more farmhouse projects that you can put up for Christmas and then leave up for winter. Alright everyone, let's get started. For the first project, I wanted to create a set of antique looking brass bells. I've been seeing a lot of bells like that on different shopping sites like Pottery Barn and Wayfair, so I wanted to try to recreate them using items from the Dollar Tree. So the Dollar Tree always has these plastic bells that they come out with every year, and they usually have them in gold and silver. So I picked out 2 of the gold ones, and I started by mixing some of this antique gold paint by Folk Art, and I added a little bit of the truffle color by Waverly. That way it would kind of dull it down a little bit and help it give a little bit of a matte finish. So you can see that's about the ratio I did. It was probably about 3/4 of the gold to about 1/4 of the truffle. And I started by giving the outside of the bell just one really good coat, and it's plastic so it gets a little bit streaky, but I did do more than 1 coat, so it kind of covers up those brush strokes the more coats that you do. Once my first coat was dry, I wanted to start in on the second coat, but I also wanted to age it up just a little bit and give it more dimension. So I added just a little bit of the truffle color to the side of my plate there. And then I went in with that mixture that I did on the first coat, and I painted a small section, and while it was still wet, I used a smaller paintbrush to add a little bit of the truffle color over top. That way, if I got it a little bit too heavy, I could blend it a lot easier because the paint was still wet, and I could make it look as streaky or as distressed as I wanted it to. So I just kept going in small sections around the bell. I would paint that mixture first, and then I would add the truffle color over top. And already you can see how different it looks from the bell we started with. Since the bells from the Dollar Tree don't come with a little ringer on the inside, I decided just to use some of the tumbling tower blocks as the ringer for these bells. So I just took 2 blocks and I painted them in that same gold and truffle color mixture that I painted on the bells. I just decided to use a little bit of jute cord to hang it from on the inside, so I wrapped it around one end of the tumbling tower blocks, and then I kind of put a little bit of hot glue on the top end of the tower block, and I only glued the jute about halfway over. That way the string looked like it was coming straight out of the top of the tower block. There was already a hole at the top of this bell, so it made it really easy to attach the ringer. So I just fished the jute cord from the inside through the top of the bell, and then I added a little bit of hot glue to the side of the top and just glued the string down in place. And it didn't matter that the end was going to show a little bit because I knew I was going to cover up the top of that bell anyway. To connect the 2 bells together, I took a length of the nautical rope, and there's scotch tape on one end whenever you open the package, and it makes it a lot easier to work with. So I wrapped a little bit of scotch tape around the other end as well, and that made it a lot easier to fish through the top of the bell. So once I had one of the ends in place, all I had to do was tie a knot in the end and then pull it tight towards the top of the bell again, and then that way the knot held it in place from the inside. Depending on how you choose to decorate your bells will depend on if you need to do this step or not. So since I wasn't sure exactly how I was gonna decorate the top of my bells, I decided to go ahead and use some jute twine to cover up that messy part of the top of the bell, and then that way it kind of blended in with the nautical rope that I used as well. I decided to keep the decorating on my bells pretty easy, so I took one of these garland ties from the Dollar Tree and I cut it in half, and I wrapped one piece around each bell, and I just twisted it kind of like you would a twist tie just to hold it in place. And then they've also come out with this greenery this year that's really pretty. It's different shades of green. It has a tiny little bit of glitter on it, and it has these white little snowballs. So I decided to take a few pieces of that greenery and glue it to the front of each bell, and then I added in a few little mini pine cones on top of that too. I wanted my bells to hang a little bit staggered, like I wanted one stacked up on top of the other one a little bit. So I laid it out how I wanted it to hang, and then I just took some jute twine and I wrapped it around a couple inches down from the fold of the rope, and I just wrapped it around a few times, and then I just tied a simple bow right onto the front of the bells. I found these really pretty house shelves at the Dollar Tree, and I think they're cute how they are, but I wanted to give it a makeover for the winter. So these types of things from the Dollar Tree have like a paper coating on them that has the design on it, and I've been seeing a lot of people using a wet washcloth to remove the paper, and it worked pretty well. So I soaked the washcloth and I laid it on the house for a good while, and it softened up the paper enough that I could scrape it, and then I could just use my washcloth to remove the excess until I was just down to the particle board underneath the house sticker. I actually didn't find these houses at my local Dollar Tree. I was out visiting my BFF Sonia, and we were at her Dollar Tree. We live about 30 minutes away from each other, and I found these at the store in her town. So if you could do me a favor, everybody say hi to my best friend Sonia in the comments, because I know she would really love that. Once I had all the paper removed from my house, I let it dry out a good bit, and then I gave it 2 coats of the Plaster Color by Waverly. And I made sure that I got the edges really well, and I actually painted underneath the shelf too, because I wasn't sure if I was going to hang this or set it on something, and if it was hanging, I didn't want you to see that raw wood underneath. I wanted the roof of my house to look like it had shingles on it, so to get started I cut some regular popsicle sticks down to about 2 inches in length. And I always like to use my paper trimmer for this. If you guys have been around for a while, you know that. And I always have it linked in my description box. For the shingles on my roof, I decided to use the Antique Wax by Waverly as a little bit of a wood stain. And I used a baby wipe to apply it. That way I kind of was able to apply it and wipe off the excess all in one step. And because these sticks are so little, I decided to put gloves on because, as you can see, it got pretty messy. I needed a guide for where my roof should start, so I used my ruler and I laid it down, and I kind of connected the 2 bottom corners of the roof and drew a line with my pencil so that I would have a straight line for my sticks. So to get started, with the very first row, I started in the center and I laid a stick down, and then I glued a stick on each side of it, and that fit pretty perfectly across the bottom of the roof. Then for the second row, I wanted to brick lay the sticks so that they would stagger a little bit. So I glued the 2 sticks down that were going to remain whole, that I didn't need to trim down. And then for the edges, I took one of the sticks and I held it in place with a clamp without gluing it. And then I flipped it over, and I was able to use my pencil to draw a line as to where I needed to cut that stick before I glued it down. I like to use my miter shears for cutting sticks on angles like this, because I find when I use scissors it tends to splinter the ends a little bit. So once I had my piece, I just used a little bit more hot glue, and then I was able to glue that right onto the end, and it fit in perfectly, and the angle was just right for the roof. So I just repeated this the whole way up until I got to the top of the roof. I would just glue down any sticks that I didn't need to cut first, and then I would go through and do the ones on the ends and draw the lines where I needed to, and then use my shears to cut those off. And I made sure that I continued staggering the sticks so that none of the seams between them lined up anywhere, so that it had a nice brick lay pattern to it. Now, I know this seems a bit time consuming, and it was. I mean, it did take quite a few minutes to get all of these sticks cut and glued into place, which I didn't mind. I thought it was really fun. But if that's not something that you're interested in, you could definitely just paint the roof a different color from the house, and I think that would look just as good too. So the one thing that I made sure when I was gluing all these sticks on was I made sure that I really squeezed it up against the previous row, because I didn't mind if there was a little bit of a gap showing here or there, because this is rustic, so it didn't matter if it was a little bit off, but I wanted to get those sticks as close as I could so that none of the paint color underneath showed through. Once I had all the sticks on the roof in place, I decided to cover up the raw edges with just a few more sticks, and I actually got lucky because 2 sticks fit perfectly on each side, so I didn't have to cut any of them down in length. To cover up the bottom edge of the roof line, I took a piece of one of the garland ties and I trimmed it down really well to make sure that those bristles were really close to that wire, and then I just hot glued that into place. I was excited to see that the Dollar Tree brought these wooden stickers back out again this year. So I took one of the snowflakes, and there's a little foam dot on the back of it, and I just left that there, but I added a little bit of hot glue just to make it a little bit more secure, and then I added that to the center of the roof. To create a door for my house, I'm using one of these giant craft sticks, but I'm just using it as a pattern. So I laid it down on a piece of black cardstock, and I traced around the end of it as tall as I thought I needed for my door, and then I just cut that out and glued that right to the center of my house. For the windows on my house, I'm using the same black cardstock, and I cut a strip that was a 1/2 inch wide. Then I cut 2 squares that were a 1/2 inch tall, so it was a 1/2 inch by a 1/2 inch. And then I cut 2 rectangles that were 3/4 inch by a 1/2 inch and 3/4 inch by a 1/2 inch. I hope that makes sense. You'll see how it is when I go to lay it out. To get my windows evenly spaced out, I clamped my ruler onto my house so that I would have a little bit of a guide as to where I needed to put my little pieces of cardstock. So I started about 1 inch from the one side, and I glued my 2 little squares down first, and then I glued the 2 little rectangles underneath it, and I left a little bit of a gap in between all the pieces so that it would look like a window. And then I repeated the same thing on the other side. To make my house look a little more wintry, I decided to use the plaster color, and I dry brushed the paint all along the roof line and a little bit on that green garland, and then I went ahead and I dry brushed over the windows and the door a little bit too, just to make them look a little bit frosty and a little bit snowy. Since the front of this house had a little shelf on it, you don't have to glue your little things in place if you don't want to, but I wanted mine to be kind of permanent, so I decided to go ahead and glue everything in place. And I decided to decorate mine up with a little bottle brush tree and a few pine cones, and then I thought it would be fun to create a little wood pile with some cinnamon sticks that I just cut down and then tied up with twine, and then I gave them a little bit of snowy look to them too with a little more dry brushing of the plaster color. Okay, so for the last project, I wanted to create a fun little candle holder. So I took one of these square candle holders from the Dollar Tree, and I have this wider burlap ribbon on hand. I think I got it at Michael's, and I started by hot gluing it the whole way around the square glass container. I just added glue to the bottom and the top of the container because you can see that this ribbon is a lot wider than the container itself, but I was going to trim it off later anyway. And anytime I use burlap like this, I always make sure that I either use my finger protectors or my spatula, because that hot glue just seeps right through that burlap and it'll get you every time. Once my burlap was in place, then I just used the top of the glass container as my guide, and I just trimmed the burlap down as close as I could to the top of the container. Then starting at the bottom of my container, I glued my first cinnamon stick down onto the top of the burlap. And I did that on opposing sides. So I glued one stick down and then I flipped it over and I glued the other stick down. And then when I turned it upright, I glued the next set of cinnamon sticks right on top of the other ones going in the opposite direction. So it's kind of like how you would build a log cabin. You just want to stack your cinnamon sticks around the container. And I only did 2 rows on mine. I did 2 rows on each side so that it was 4 sticks total. No, 8 sticks. Yeah, because there's 4 sides. So it was 8 sticks total. To cover up the raw edge of the burlap on the top of the container, I'm using another one of those garland ties, and I'm just hot gluing it the whole way around the top. Now, one of the garland ties didn't fit quite the whole way around, but I was able to just cut down a small piece from a second one and add that in as a filler. Now, I wasn't planning on using a real candle in this, so that's why I decided to go ahead and glue that garland tie to the top, because I was going to use something battery powered, and actually I couldn't even find a battery powered candle in my stash. I thought I had a little votive, but I didn't. So I just tucked some fairy lights in it and it looked really cute too. To keep with the winter theme, I used the plaster color again and I dry brushed around the cinnamon sticks on the votive holder, and then I did dry brush a little bit on that greenery, although it didn't really show up quite as well. For the embellishment on the front of my candle holder, I just created a simple bow using some black and white stripe ribbon that I found at Walmart this year. And I just glued some greenery onto it and some little mini pine cones and some little snowballs, and then I just hot glued that right to the front of my candle holder. So when is too soon to start decorating for Christmas? Because I have a 3-day weekend coming up and I'm thinking I should probably put my tree up. Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, hit subscribe, ring the bell, do all the things. Have a great week and I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye!